problems with the investigation so far, but remember, we are seeing through a mirror darkly. We don't know all the evidence. There's been one state's autopsy, and that has not been released. The family sent the body of Nolan Wells for a second independent autopsy, and that autopsy says undetermined. But this is what I do know, Griff. I know on the back of his head, the occipital bone back here, there is deep red subcutaneous tissue. It's not anywhere else. It is not pooling of the blood once he's died. The blood pools at the lowest point. It's not that, because it's only there. I'm curious, does that suggest a blow to the head? There are many accidental possibilities. When you look at the video out there are tons of boats. They're close together. Did he drink and drown in between one of those boats and nobody noticed? I don't know that. However, that deep reddening on the occipital bone is very disturbing to me. Also, you'd think, oh, he drowned, but we don't have the lungs. When the second autopsy got the body, the lungs and the throat were missing. Now, I understand, Griff, why they took the lungs to determine if he had drowned, but why was the neck missing? What about the interior of the throat sparked the initial medical examiner's concern? Was there some bruising on the...
Baby, they done dug Nancy Grace out of retirement for this Nolan Wells case. Somebody going to jail. No, scratch that. They're going to jail. You know how Nancy talk in that high-pitched voice once she get a little passionate about something. They lured that young man and pushed him off the boat. Then they erased his cellular device. Not his I-7, his cellular device. Nancy used words like lured. You know, we be like, nah, he tried to set me up, but I was too smart for that. Nancy said they lured him. They knew what they were going to do before they did it. Nancy even went to dig up their parents. She was like, and it turns out they are friends with everyone in the city, including the main judge. They should be locked up too. Nancy don't say their parents. Nancy said their parents. Like Terrence. Nancy got me through the whole Diddy case. She surely did. Nancy pulled a Tootsie Roll Mini out her bag and was like, what does this Tootsie Mini remind you of? Diddy's privacy. How many licks does it take to get to the center of his Tootsie Pop? One. Not one. One. I said, yeah, Nancy, she gonna get to the bottom of some shit. When Grace is on the case, bitch, hide your face, bitch. No evidence will go to waste, bitch. And after you dig up this whole little story right here, Nancy, go ahead and relive that Carmelo Anthony story. We need to see what's going on with that too.
There is a sentence that has been copied and pasted across social media more than almost anything else connected to the Nolan Wells case. It shows up in comment sections, in reposts, in all caps declarations underneath grainy screenshots of cable news. The sentence goes something like this: now that Nancy's awake, everybody's going to jail. Read that again. Not now we might get answers. Not now there will be more scrutiny. Everybody's going to jail. As if a television host clearing her throat is the same thing as a jury returning a verdict. As if the simple act of one famous woman deciding to care about an 18-year-old from Mississippi is on its own a form of justice already delivered. That reaction is the real story tonight. Not because Nancy Grace broke new evidence. She didn't. Not because she has some secret pipeline into the Jackson County Sheriff's Office that the rest of the press doesn't have. She doesn't. The reaction is the story because it tells you something true and something a little bit dangerous about how cases like this one actually move through the world in the year 2025. It tells you what a spotlight can do, and it tells you what a spotlight can break. So tonight we are not simply reporting that a famous face showed up. We are going to sit inside this moment and actually think it through. What does it mean mechanically when a figure like Nancy Grace turns her show toward a case like Nolan Wells? What can that kind of attention genuinely accomplish? Why does so much of the reaction, especially inside the Black community that has rallied around this family, read her arrival less like a news event and more like the cavalry finally showing up? And where underneath all of that hope is there real danger hiding? Danger that has already touched people in this exact case who have never been charged with anything at all. This is not a takedown of Nancy Grace. It is not a celebration of her either. It is an honest accounting of what happens when a case this raw, this unresolved, and this painful gets handed a national microphone. Because before we can talk about what her involvement means, we have to remember who this is actually about. Not a hashtag, not a cable segment, an 18-year-old young man named Nolan Xavier Wells who was supposed to come home on the 4th of July and never did. If you are new to Mr. Story's Crime Vault, we have been following the Nolan Wells case from the very beginning, piece by piece, correcting the record when the internet got ahead of itself and refusing to turn a grieving family into entertainment. If that is the kind of coverage you want, go ahead and hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel, because tonight we are going deeper into this case than almost anyone else is willing to go. We want to be upfront with you about something before we go any further. This is not going to be a video that tells you Nancy Grace solved this case. It is not going to be a video that tells you her involvement is nothing but a distraction either. Both of those framings are lazy, and both of them let you off the hook from actually thinking about what is happening here. What we are going to give you instead is the full picture. What she said, what it means, who it helps, who it could hurt, and where this investigation genuinely stands tonight. Strip away the noise. By the end of this, you are going to understand this case and this moment inside it better than almost anyone else discussing it online right now. Before Nancy Grace ever said his name into a microphone, before Ben Crump ever stood at a podium, before a single hashtag existed, Nolan Wells was just a kid from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, trying to figure out the rest of his life. He had just graduated from Ocean Springs High School. He was headed into his first season as a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. One more step on a path that people around him swear he had been walking with real purpose. Friends described him as big-hearted, the kind of person who never met a stranger. Not a performance of friendliness, an actual consistent habit of making other people feel seen. Teachers remembered him fondly enough to reach out to his mother after he was gone. Teammates remembered him as someone who showed up, who put in the work, who talked about his future without a trace of doubt in his voice. The night before the 4th of July, his mother, Christine Wansley, made the family salmon for dinner. It was an ordinary weeknight meal in an ordinary home. The kind of evening nobody thinks to memorize, because nothing about it seems like it needs to be remembered. Before Nolan left to spend the night at a friend's house ahead of the holiday, he told her, "Hey Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." A hug, a kiss, and he walked out the door. That is the whole memory. No warning in it, no premonition, just a mother's recollection of an entirely ordinary goodbye that turned out, without her knowing in that moment, to be the last one she would ever get to have with her son in the way she expected to have it. Every detail in this case that comes after that goodbye is going to be argued over by lawyers, investigators, television hosts, and strangers on the internet who never met him. That single memory belongs only to Christine Wansley, the way it will belong to any mother. And no update to this case, whatever it eventually turns out to be, is going to change what that goodbye meant to her. On July 4th, Nolan traveled by private boat with a group of friends out to Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast that you can only reach by water. There are no buildings out there, no cell towers close enough to guarantee a signal, no lifeguards, no stores, nothing but sand, surf, and on a holiday like that one, hundreds of people spread out across the shoreline celebrating the 4th, the way people along the Gulf Coast have celebrated for generations. Nolan was last seen by most accounts sometime around 3 that afternoon near the island's northwestern tip, wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses. According to the accounts his friends gave investigators, the group's boat began taking on water. A bilge pump had failed. Around 4:30 that afternoon, the group made the decision to head back toward the mainland, and according to that same account, Nolan decided to stay behind, planning to catch a later ride, possibly after spending time with a young woman he had met on the island earlier that day. He never got that later ride. Nolan's mother reported him missing that night. A search effort involving the Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and a volunteer group known as the United Cajun Navy launched the following morning. 2 days later, on July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found his body in the water off the same northwestern shoreline where he had last been seen alive. He was formally identified not through a visual confirmation from a family member, but through dental records, a detail that on its own tells you something about the condition investigators were working with. That is the foundation of this case. Everything else, every press conference, every viral clip, every argument in a comment section, sits on top of those bare facts. A young man went to a crowded public beach with friends on the busiest boating week of the year. He did not come home, and 2 days later, the water gave him back. It is worth pausing here before we go any further into press conferences and cable segments and viral audio clips to remember what that actually looks like from the inside of a family. It looks like a mother pacing a dock at sunset because the boat that left with her son on it came back without him. It looks like a father who taught his son one simple rule his entire life. If you go with a group, you stay with a group. Now turning that rule over and over in his mind, searching for the version of events where his son broke it for a reason that makes sense. It looks like a search spanning 2 days involving the Coast Guard, State Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and volunteers who had never met Nolan Wells in their lives, but showed up anyway, because that is simply what a coastal community does when one of its own goes missing. And it looks like the exact moment on July 6th when a park ranger's radio call turned a missing person search into something no family should ever have to hear announced over dispatch. Every single thing that has happened in this case since that moment, the lawyers, the autopsies, the cable segments, the grand jury, exists because that moment happened first, and because two parents refused to let it be the last chapter their son's story ever gets. In the days that followed, the official response from Jackson County authorities was by most public accounts cautious. Sheriff John Ledbetter told reporters there was no information at that point suggesting a crime had occurred. The Jackson County coroner said there were no immediate signs of physical injury on the body. To a lot of people watching from outside Mississippi, that read like a small county quietly closing the book on a tragic accident before the search had even fully wound down. To Nolan's family, it read like something else entirely. They had questions that nobody in that early press conference seemed prepared to answer. Why would Nolan, described by everyone who knew him as someone who never separated from his friend group, choose this one day to stay behind alone? Why would an 18-year-old leave his phone behind on a boat when his mother says he was never without it? Why on an island packed with more than 200 people, according to some estimates, did nobody see him in the water if he had in fact drowned in the ordinary sense that word usually implies? The family retained attorney Ben Crump, the same civil rights lawyer whose name has become attached to a long list of cases where families felt the initial official response fell short of what their loved one deserved. Crump brought in additional legal support, arranged for an independent autopsy to be conducted in Washington, D.C. separate from the state's own examination, and began holding press conferences alongside the family and eventually alongside Reverend Al Sharpton. Colin Kaepernick's organization stepped in to help fund that independent autopsy. Filmmaker Tyler Perry covered the cost of Nolan's funeral. Within a matter of weeks, a case that began as a local tragedy on a Mississippi barrier island had become something closer to a national cause, with some of the most recognizable names in American civil rights advocacy attached to it. And then, as is almost always the case once a story reaches that scale, the contradictions started to surface. A viral video circulated online, purporting to capture Nolan in an argument shouting for someone to give him back his phone. A photo appeared to show him at a pool party after the date he supposedly disappeared, sparking a wave of speculation that he might have made it back to the mainland alive before something happened to him later. A young woman referred to publicly as Katie, said by Nolan's friends to be the reason he stayed behind, was reported by her sister to have given an account that directly contradicted what the friend group had told authorities and reporters. Both the video and the photo would later be walked back, corrected by outlets that did the actual work of checking them. Something we are going to come back to later in this video because it matters enormously to how you should read everything that followed. But in that window before the corrections caught up with the speculation, the case had already caught fire, and a fire, once it is burning at that scale, tends to attract everyone who has ever built a platform out of standing in front of one. Nancy Grace did not arrive at the start of this fire. She arrived after it had already been burning for weeks, after the sheriff's initial comments, after the independent autopsy had already been commissioned, after the viral video and the pool photo had already done their damage, and in the case of the photo especially, already been debunked by other outlets. What she brought to the table hours after Nolan Wells was laid to rest following his funeral in Ocean Springs was an entire hour of her program Crime Stories, devoted specifically to picking the case apart in the style she has built an entire career on. To understand what that means and why the reaction to it has been so intense, you have to understand who Nancy Grace actually is. Because both the power of her involvement and the unease some people feel about it come from the exact same place. Grace spent years as a prosecutor in Fulton County, Georgia, working under a district attorney she has described as being like a grandfather to her, a man who served for decades and drilled into her a very specific philosophy about speaking to the press. Say almost nothing. Trust the jury. Let the evidence do the talking. That is not by any reasonable measure the philosophy she has built her television career on since. Over decades in front of a camera, she has become known for something almost at the opposite instinct. Loud, forceful, unwilling to let law enforcement or prosecutors off the hook when she believes a public record does not add up. To her supporters, and there are a great many of them, that instinct makes her one of the few television figures willing to drag neglected cases into the light and keep them there long after the rest of the media has moved on to the next headline. To her critics, that same instinct has over the years sometimes meant reaching hard conclusions early, publicly and loudly, in ways that did not always hold up once all the facts eventually came out. Both of those reputations are real. Neither one cancels the other out, and both of them are relevant to understanding what happens when she turns that instinct toward Nolan Wells. On her show, she zeroed in on two things above everything else. First, the direct contradiction between the friend group's account that Nolan chose to stay behind for a young woman named Katie and the account relayed through Katie's own sister, which suggested Nolan told her he was heading back to the boat with his friends. Grace's phrasing on this point was blunt in the way her phrasing usually is. "Both cannot be true," she said. "Those cannot mutually exist. He cannot go with them and stay with her." And then the line that has traveled further than almost anything else she said that night. "I don't know who's lying, but somebody's lying." Second, she focused on the discrepancies in location data connected to Nolan's phone. The mismatch between different tracking services that Nolan's mother has described publicly. One reading tied to a family locator app, another tied to a social media platform that did not line up with each other or where the device was ultimately recovered. Grace filtering that detail through a prosecutor's instinct for what a normal margin of error should look like, flagged it as a kind of gap that does not typically happen by accident at the scale being described. It is worth pausing here on something important. Nothing Grace said that night was new information. She did not break a story. She did not produce a single piece of evidence that had not already surfaced somewhere in the reporting that came before her. As more than one outlet observed afterward, she and her guests were not presenting new information. They were reviewing known publicly available facts and reacting to them with considerable force. That distinction matters enormously, and it is exactly why understanding her role in this case requires looking past the content of what she said and toward the effect of who was saying it and how loudly. Here is a mechanical truth about what a figure like Nancy Grace actually brings to a case like this, and it would be dishonest to wave away as pure spectacle because some of it is genuinely real and genuinely valuable. The first thing she brings is a platform, and platforms are never neutral. A grieving family in a small Mississippi county, even one working with a nationally known attorney, is competing for public attention against an ocean of other stories. Attention is the scarcest resource in any case that depends even partly on public pressure to keep moving. Nancy Grace commands a large, loyal national audience built over literally decades of crime coverage. When she spends a full hour of her program on a single case, that case does not quietly fade the way so many cases fade once the initial week of news coverage passes. And fading quietly into the background is precisely what so many families in cases like this one are afraid of. Sustained attention functions as its own form of accountability. Institutions, whether that is a sheriff's office, a coroner's office, or a district attorney, behave differently when they know a large, engaged audience is watching and will not simply let a story disappear from the conversation. That is not cynicism. That is just an accurate description of how public institutions respond to sustained public scrutiny. Grace's involvement makes it considerably harder for this particular case to quietly recede from view. For a family that has said over and over that all they want is a full and transparent investigation, that alone is worth something real. The second thing she brings is a specific kind of credibility that a random online commentator simply does not have. Grace is not only a television personality, she spent years as an actual prosecutor. When she says two accounts are mutually exclusive or that a phone's location data does not add up, she is applying a prosecutor's framing to information that is already sitting in the public record. And that framing carries weight with an audience that a stranger's opinion never could. She is in effect modeling on national television the exact kind of pointed question a real prosecutor might ask behind closed doors, which can put pressure on the actual investigators handling the case to demonstrate publicly that they are asking those same questions themselves. And the third thing, harder to measure but every bit as real, is what her involvement means symbolically, particularly within the Black community that has rallied so visibly around Nolan Wells and his family. The reaction to her arrival was never really about, "We got more television coverage." It was closer to, "We got a heavyweight in our corner." There is a long, painful, well-documented history behind the fear that a young Black man's suspicious death might quietly get written off as an accident and closed without a real investigation. Grace has built, whether by design or simply by pattern, a reputation across many communities as someone willing to aggressively challenge authorities when she believes the official account is not holding up. And she has not arrived alone. She joins a genuinely remarkable list of prominent figures already attached to this case. Ben Crump representing the family. Reverend Al Sharpton offering support and calling publicly for both patience and accountability. Tyler Perry covering funeral costs. Colin Kaepernick's organization funding the independent autopsy. Media entrepreneur Byron Allen named among the case's supporters. When that many powerful, resourced, nationally recognized people converge on a single case, it tells you something important. It tells you this family is not being left to fight alone, which is a genuine advantage in any fight against institutional silence. But it also tells you that this case has become, for better and for worse, a national cause. And national causes generate their own gravity, their own momentum, and their own pressure to arrive at a satisfying ending, sometimes independent of wherever the actual evidence eventually leads. So when Grace's arrival was received online as a signal that this case would finally be fought for and not quietly fought away, that symbolic weight is not nothing. It is not nothing for a family, and it is not nothing for a community carrying a very specific, well-earned fear of being dismissed. A nationally known figure loudly refusing to let a story go can feel like the difference between being heard and being ignored. And it is worth honoring exactly why that fear exists in the first place, rather than dismissing it as paranoia. It is grounded in a long documented history of cases where the deaths of young Black Americans were closed too quickly, investigated too casually, or explained away far too conveniently for comfort. When people online say they feel relieved that Nancy Grace is now watching this case, they are not being irrational. They are responding to a pattern they have every reason to distrust. So yes, the relief people felt when she showed up is legitimate, even if the everybody's going to jail confidence riding alongside that relief is not. You can validate the fear that produces a celebration without endorsing the fantasy that sometimes rides on top of it. Both of those things can be true at the exact same time, and holding them at the same time is the entire point of thinking about this moment honestly, instead of reflexively. But here's the other half of this story. The half that is much harder to say out loud on social media, where nuance tends to get buried under whichever version of events makes people feel the most certain. The same intense emotional national attention that pressures officials to do their jobs properly also supercharges everything else swirling around a case like this one, including the parts of it that hurt real private people who have done nothing wrong. And this specific case has already shown in painful detail exactly how that downside plays out. Long before Nancy Grace ever said Nolan's name on air, this story had already produced online threats directed at his teenage friends. It had already produced harassment and doxing aimed at his own grieving mother. It had already produced a flood of AI-generated fake videos and images. It had already produced a rumor that spread so quickly and so widely that an entirely unrelated young woman's family had to publicly step forward just to confirm that she was not in fact missing. That is what a superheated national spotlight does to a case. It does not only illuminate, it also ignites. And it does not always ignite the things that actually deserve the fire. When a figure with a platform the size of Nancy Grace's pours even more heat onto a story already burning at that intensity, the pressure that lands on officials is real. But so is the pressure that lands often indiscriminately on everyone else. The family sent Nolan's body for a second independent autopsy after the initial state examination. That second autopsy was conducted in Washington, D.C., and funded in part by Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Rights Camp organization. The result of that independent examination was a finding of undetermined, meaning the medical examiner could not definitively rule out foul play, but could not definitively confirm it either. What the independent autopsy did reveal was significant physical evidence that has been at the center of almost every conversation about this case since. On the back of Nolan's head at the occipital bone, the second medical examiner found deep red subcutaneous tissue. Subcutaneous means under the skin. During an autopsy, the skin is pulled away from the body to examine the tissue underneath. That is where this finding was located. The tissue marking measured approximately 12 inches by 8 inches. It was found only in that location, nowhere else on the body. According to Nancy Grace and the medical professionals she consulted on her program, that specificity matters. When someone dies, blood typically pools at the lowest point of the body due to gravity. This finding was not consistent with that kind of post-mortem blood pooling. It was isolated, localized, and according to those consulted, suggested trauma to that specific area. The question that finding raises is obvious. Does that suggest a blow to the head? There are, according to the experts Grace brought onto her show, many accidental possibilities. Horn Island on the 4th of July was crowded with boats packed close together. Video from that day shows just how tightly the vessels were clustered along the shoreline. Could Nolan have fallen, struck his head on a boat or another object, and gone into the water without anyone noticing? It is possible, but that possibility raises its own question. If he fell and hit his head hard enough to cause that kind of tissue trauma, why did nobody see him go over? With hundreds of people present and boats packed as closely as the video evidence suggests, how does an 18-year-old suffer a significant head injury and enter the water without a single witness coming forward? The second piece of evidence that has drawn intense scrutiny is not what the independent autopsy found, but what it did not find. When the second medical examiner received Nolan's body, the lungs and the throat tissue were missing. They had been removed and retained by the state medical examiner who conducted the first autopsy. Nancy Grace addressed this directly on her program. She acknowledged that it makes sense for a medical examiner to retain the lungs in a potential drowning case. Examining the lungs is a standard part of determining whether someone drowned. But the throat tissue, she argued, raised a different question. What about the interior of the throat sparked the initial medical examiner's concern? Was there bruising on the neck that would suggest strangulation or compression? Why was that tissue retained and not made available for the independent examination? As of the recording of this video, the findings of the state's autopsy have not been publicly released. The family, their legal team, and now a national audience are waiting for that report. What it says about the throat tissue, about the head trauma, about the cause of death, could answer some of the questions that have been swirling since July, or it could deepen them. The contradiction that Nancy Grace highlighted most forcefully, the one that has been repeated across social media and in every subsequent news report, centers on the accounts given about why Nolan stayed on the island while his friends left. According to the friends, Nolan chose to remain behind to spend time with Katie, a young woman he had met earlier that day. The plan, according to their version, was for him to catch a ride back to the mainland later. But Katie's sister relayed a different account. According to what Katie reportedly told her family, Nolan said he was leaving with his friends. He did not say he was staying. He said goodbye and indicated he was heading back to the boat. Those two versions cannot coexist. If Nolan told Katie he was leaving with his friends, then the friend's account that he chose to stay does not hold. If he told his friends he was staying for Katie, then Katie's recollection does not hold. Nancy Grace framed this as a prosecutorial problem. Both statements cannot be true. One of them is inaccurate, whether through intentional deception, misunderstanding, or faulty memory. But the existence of that contradiction means investigators have a credibility problem at the very foundation of the timeline. And until that contradiction is resolved, the rest of the sequence of events remains in question. The other evidentiary issue Grace focused on involves Nolan's phone. His mother, Christine Wansley, has stated publicly that Nolan was never without his phone. Friends reported that the phone was left on the boat when Nolan stayed behind. But location data from different tracking services used by the family showed readings that did not align with each other or with where the phone was eventually recovered. One tracking application showed one location. Another platform showed a different location, and neither matched the final recovery site. Grace, applying a prosecutor's standard, noted that some variance in GPS data is normal. Phones ping off different towers. Apps update at different intervals. But the scale of discrepancy being described, she argued, goes beyond the typical margin of error. That kind of gap raises questions about whether the phone was moved, whether it was turned off and back on in different locations, or whether something else occurred that has not been explained. There is also the matter of an audio recording that surfaced online, purporting to capture the moments when Nolan's friends were returning to the mainland without him. In the recording, which has circulated widely on social media, someone can be heard saying, "Wake the F up." The context of that phrase, who said it, who they were speaking to, and when exactly it was recorded, has not been definitively established. Nancy Grace stated on her program that she would not rest until she determined whether that audio was authentic or doctored. If it is real, the question becomes, who were they talking to and why? Was someone on the boat unresponsive? Was it directed at Nolan? Was it said before they left the island or after? Without verified context, the audio functions more as a source of speculation than evidence. But its existence, authentic or not, has added another layer of question marks to an already complicated picture. A Mississippi grand jury has been convened to review the evidence and determine whether criminal charges are warranted in Nolan Wells' death. Grand juries operate in secrecy. They review evidence presented by prosecutors, hear testimony from witnesses, and decide whether probable cause exists to bring charges against anyone. The public does not get to see what happens inside that room. The family does not get to see it either. What comes out is a decision, either an indictment or a no bill, meaning no charges. That process is ongoing. As of this recording, no decision has been announced. The family, their attorneys, and the public are waiting. And that waiting is where a case like this one lives for weeks or sometimes months, in the gap between what is known and what might eventually be revealed, in the space between a mother's grief and a system's timeline, in the tension between the pressure of national attention and the slow, deliberate pace of an investigation that may or may not be moving as thoroughly as it should. What Nancy Grace's involvement has done, more than anything else, is make it nearly impossible for that waiting to happen quietly. Her platform, her audience, and her willingness to publicly frame the unanswered questions in prosecutorial terms have ensured that this case will not fade from view while the grand jury deliberates. For a family that fears their son's death being written off and filed away, that is a meaningful form of protection. But it also means the pressure is now enormous, not just on investigators, but on everyone touched by this case. The friends who were on the boat that day have not been charged with a crime. They have been named in news reports, discussed on national television, and subjected to online harassment. Their accounts are being scrutinized, their credibility questioned, their social media profiles dissected by strangers. They are teenagers, and they are being treated by a significant portion of the internet as suspects in a murder that has not been proven to have occurred. Katie, the young woman Nolan reportedly spent time with on the island, has had her privacy shredded. She has not been accused of anything. She is a witness whose recollection differs from another witness's recollection. That happens in investigations all the time. Memory is fallible. Stress distorts perception. People describe the same event differently without anyone lying. But in the court of social media, a contradiction is treated as proof of guilt, and a private citizen becomes a public target. Christine Wansley, Nolan's mother, has faced harassment online from people who believe she is pushing a false narrative or exploiting her son's death. The cruelty of that harassment, aimed at a woman who lost her child and is asking for answers, is difficult to overstate, and it is a direct result of the kind of heat a case generates when it becomes a national cause. This is the double edge of the spotlight. It can force accountability. It can also burn indiscriminately. And once a case reaches the temperature this one has reached, separating the two becomes almost impossible. Nancy Grace did not create that heat. The case was already viral, already polarized, already the subject of misinformation and conspiracy theories before she ever turned her cameras toward it. What she did was add fuel to a fire that was already burning. Whether that fuel ultimately helps bring justice for Nolan Wells, or whether it consumes people who do not deserve to be consumed, is a question that will not be answered until the grand jury speaks, and possibly not even then. What we know right now, stripped of speculation, is this. An 18-year-old young man went to a barrier island with friends on the 4th of July. He did not come home. His body was found 2 days later. An independent autopsy found evidence of head trauma that has not been explained. Witness accounts about his final hours contradict each other. His phone's location data does not align in ways that have not been clarified. The state's autopsy has not been released. A grand jury is reviewing the evidence. And a mother is waiting for answers while the rest of the country watches, argues, speculates, and in some corners demands a conviction before an investigation has even concluded. That is where we are. Not at justice, not at closure, at noise. Loud, sustained, impossible to ignore noise. And somewhere inside that noise is the truth about what happened to Nolan Xavier Wells. Nancy Grace's role in this case will be judged ultimately not by what she said, but by what happens next. If her involvement keeps pressure on investigators to do their jobs thoroughly and transparently, if it prevents this case from being quietly shelved, if it ensures that every question gets asked and every piece of evidence gets examined, then her arrival will have mattered in a way that goes beyond television ratings. But if the superheated attention she brings leads to a rush to judgment, to charges brought or not brought based on public pressure rather than evidence, to innocent people being destroyed by a mob that conflates suspicion with proof, then the cost of that spotlight will have been too high. Both outcomes are possible. Both have happened before in cases she has covered. The difference will be determined not by her, but by the investigators, the prosecutors, the grand jury, and the system that is supposed to deliver justice based on evidence rather than emotion. We are watching in real time to see which version of this story we get. If you have made it this far, you care about getting this right. You care about the difference between facts and speculation. You care about a family that deserves answers, and a system that needs to be held accountable, without destroying people who may be innocent. That is exactly what Mr. Story's Crime Vault is built to do. Slow, Careful, responsible coverage of cases that deserve better than viral clips and comment section trials. If that matters to you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button on this video. We are going to stay on this case until we have answers, and we are going to do it the right way. We need to talk about what happens when a phrase like "somebody's lying" gets broadcast to millions of people who have already spent weeks being primed to want a villain. Take that single line that traveled further than any other phrase Nancy Grace used that night. As pure logic, it is a completely fair point. Two mutually exclusive accounts cannot both be entirely true. And that contradiction genuinely does need to be resolved by someone with the authority and the evidence to resolve it. But listen to how a phrase like that actually lands on an audience of millions of people who have been conditioned by weeks of coverage to demand answers right now. Somebody's lying functions, whether intended or not, as an invitation to go find the liar yourself. And in this specific case, the people whose accounts are in tension with each other are Nolan's teenage friends and a young woman named Katie. None of them have been charged with anything. At least one of them has already been the target of false rumors and online cruelty simply for being mentioned in connection to this story at all. A prosecutor standing inside an actual courtroom is bounded by rules of evidence, by process, by real legal consequences for overstepping. The exact same words broadcast to a vast emotionally invested online audience carry none of those guardrails. They can, and in cases exactly like this one they often do, translate directly into ordinary young people being hunted online by total strangers who have appointed themselves as detectives, judges, and juries all at once. Nobody is suggesting Nancy Grace intends that outcome, but the machine she is part of has a documented tendency to produce exactly that outcome, and intention does not undo real-world impact. There is a specific asymmetry buried in all of this that deserves to be named plainly. When a figure with a platform is right to be suspicious, the benefit of that suspicion flows toward a large, diffuse system. Officials feel more pressure. A case stays open longer than it might have otherwise. The upside spreads thin across an entire institution. But when that same online energy misfires, and it does misfire regularly, the cost lands squarely on specific named, identifiable individuals. A teenage friend, a young woman barely out of her teens. People who absorb that harm personally, immediately, and often permanently, long after the news cycle has moved on to something else. The downside concentrates sharply and painfully on a handful of private people who never asked to be part of a national story. That asymmetry alone should make anyone holding a large platform extraordinarily careful with phrases like "somebody's lying," because the person who ultimately pays the price for a careless framing is almost never the official it was aimed at in the first place. It is far more often the ordinary young person standing closest to the contradiction. Someone who was simply present on a beach on the 4th of July and is now living with strangers, deciding from thousands of miles away that they already know exactly what kind of person they are. Consider what this has already looked like in practice, described plainly and publicly by the people living through it. Trecan Shepard, the friend who came forward twice to correct the public record, has said openly that he and others in the friend group have received death threats since Nolan's body was recovered. He declined to appear on camera for at least one interview specifically because of those threats, choosing instead to speak only through audio, with his voice altered and his face never shown. A level of caution that a completely uninvolved young man should never have to take, simply for telling the truth as he understood it. Elsewhere, a young woman connected to the friend group described missing an actual funeral, a friend's funeral, because she had received thousands of death threats aimed at her and her family and had to put her own physical safety ahead of showing up to grieve alongside people she cared about. Nolan's own mother has not been spared either. Christine Wansley has spoken publicly about being accused by strangers online of exploiting her son's death for a GoFundMe campaign. She has described being called racist. She has described AI-generated videos, fabricated entirely, circulating online and depicting her in ways that are simply not real. Manufactured footage of a grieving mother spreading for engagement while she is actively trying to plan her son's funeral. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. A woman who has already lost her 18-year-old son is now also fighting off manufactured video content built specifically to manipulate how the public perceives her at the exact moment she has the least capacity in her entire life to fight back against anything at all. None of that began with Nancy Grace. All of it predates her involvement by weeks. But it is the exact environment her broadcast entered into. An environment already primed for outrage, already producing real harm against real people. Some of whom, like Trecan Shepard, have done nothing but try to correct the record honestly. And others, like Christine Wansley, have done nothing but grieve in public, because grieving in private was never an option once the story reached the scale it reached. Any additional heat poured onto that environment, regardless of who is pouring it or why, lands inside a system that has already demonstrated it does not distribute harm fairly or accurately. It distributes harm toward whoever happens to be standing closest to the camera when the anger boils over. It is worth putting Grace's rhetorical style directly next to the language actually being used by the officials running this investigation, because the contrast tells you something important about how differently these two worlds communicate under pressure. In a public statement responding to the intensity building around this case, the Jackson County District Attorney addressed the community directly. She said that every death in the county except those from natural causes and non-criminal accidents is presented to a grand jury as a matter of standard practice, and that Nolan's case is being handled with the same care and the same commitment to the truth given to every death investigation her office has ever handled. She acknowledged the public's urgency directly, stating plainly that her office is not taking time for time's sake, but is instead taking the time the specific investigation actually demands. She described a responsibility to complete the investigation thoroughly, carefully, without compromise, and in a way that would be worthy of the community's confidence. That is measured, careful, deliberately unemotional language. The kind of language institutions use, precisely because they know an ill-considered public statement can complicate an active investigation, or in the worst case, jeopardize a future prosecution entirely. It is also, by design, far less satisfying to listen to than an hour of Nancy Grace pressing a forensic pathologist about post-mortem discoloration on the back of a young man's skull. Neither register is wrong. They serve fundamentally different purposes. An elected prosecutor speaking on the record has to protect the integrity of a case that may eventually go to trial. A cable news host filling an hour of programming has no such institutional obligation weighing on every word she chooses. That difference in incentive alone explains an enormous amount of why these two versions of the same case, the official one and the televised one, can sound like they are describing almost entirely separate investigations, even when they are underneath it all pointing at exactly the same unresolved facts. There is a second risk here, quieter than harassment but every bit as corrosive over time. When a case becomes a genuine national entertainment product, complete with clearly defined heroes, clearly defined villains, and the promise of a dramatic reveal waiting somewhere around the corner, the emotional narrative that builds up around it can start to outrun the actual evidence sitting in the case file. Nancy Grace certainly makes for compelling television. That is not a criticism. It is simply an accurate description of the format she has built her entire career around. But the real factual present-tense state of the Nolan Wells case is radically uncertain. As of this recording, the official autopsy remains undetermined. The cause of death has not been publicly established. The contradictions in the various accounts remain unresolved, precisely because the evidence needed to resolve them, the phone data, the toxicology results, the full findings from both the state's autopsy and the family's independent one, has not yet been made public. There is a genuine danger in that gap. When a charismatic, trusted figure declares with total confidence that the official story simply does not add up, an audience can lock in a conclusion well before the evidence has actually earned that conclusion. Sometimes that instinct for skepticism is later vindicated. Sometimes it is not, but a public that has already decided in its own mind exactly what happened, cheered along by a confident and trusted broadcaster, can become remarkably resistant to any eventual official finding that does not match the story it was originally sold. And if the evidence, whenever it finally surfaces, points somewhere less dramatic and less satisfying than the narrative that built up around it, the people who were promised a clear villain may simply refuse to accept that finding at all. Worse, they may turn their anger toward the very officials who spent months following the evidence honestly wherever it actually led. Both of these truths need to be held at the exact same time, because that balance is the entire point of thinking about a moment like this seriously, instead of picking a side and stopping there. Nancy Grace's involvement genuinely can help. It can keep a legitimate, still unresolved case in the national spotlight. It can pressure authorities to be transparent and thorough in a way they might not otherwise be forced to be. It can help ensure a grieving family is not simply ignored the way so many families before them have been. And Nancy Grace's involvement genuinely can cause harm. It can intensify a mob dynamic that has already provably threatened innocent, uncharged people. It can harden public certainty well ahead of the actual evidence. Both of those things are true. And which one ends up dominating the story depends almost entirely on how the attention gets used and by whom, once the spotlight is already on and no longer fully within anyone's control. It is worth zooming out for a moment to notice that Nancy Grace is not operating in isolation here. She is one node inside a much larger ecosystem that has attached itself to this case. An ecosystem made up of independent podcasters, true crime channels exactly like this one, self-styled internet detectives combing through GPS records and Snapchat metadata, and commentators reading the entire tragedy through the lens of race relations in America. Some of that ecosystem is doing careful, responsible work. Some of it is doing real harm. Almost all of it is feeding off the same underlying hunger. The hunger to be the one who finally cracks the case. To be the channel or the account or the commenter who spotted the detail everyone else missed. That hunger is not new to true crime as a genre, but the speed and scale at which it now operates is genuinely different from even a decade ago. A GPS timeline gets pulled from a public records request by a national outlet, and within hours it has been cut into a dozen different video essays, each one drawing its own confident conclusion from the exact same 11 data points. A single ambiguous phrase in a distress call gets isolated, slowed down, and re-uploaded so many times that by the time it reaches a viewer scrolling late at night, it has traveled through 5 or 6 different creators, each one adding their own layer of certainty on top of the last, until the original actually quite modest piece of audio has been transformed into something resembling ironclad proof of a crime nobody has actually charged anyone with committing. Nancy Grace did not create that ecosystem, but her involvement supercharges it, because her audience is enormous, her platform is established, and anything she discusses on air becomes instant raw material for every smaller channel downstream of her, clipped, captioned, and recirculated within minutes of her broadcast ending. That is simply how attention moves through the specific media environment we have now, cascading outward from the largest platform to the smallest one, gathering confidence at every single stop along the way, whether or not that confidence is actually earned by anything new being discovered. There is something genuinely fascinating and a little bit unsettling about the entire phenomenon we just walked through, and it is worth sitting with directly rather than rushing past it toward the next headline. The reaction to Nancy Grace's arrival, that instinctive "everybody's going to jail now" response, reveals a belief that is widespread, deeply understandable, and just a little bit dangerous all at the same time. It is a belief that justice at its core is fundamentally a matter of attention. The belief that the reason cases like this one go unsolved or unpunished is simply a lack of spotlight, and that if you can just get a big enough celebrity, a big enough platform, a big enough audience to care, the outcome will naturally bend toward justice on its own. And there is a painful kernel of truth buried inside that belief. Attention genuinely does affect outcomes in the real world. Cases with powerful resourced advocates attached to them do in practice get treated differently by institutions than cases without any advocate at all. That is a real, well-documented and genuinely troubling feature of how our system actually functions. But it is also a dangerous thing to believe all the way down, because it quietly locates the source of justice in fame rather than in evidence. It implies, whether we mean it to or not, that the loudest, most telegenic cases somehow deserve resolution more than the quiet ones sitting untouched in filing cabinets across the country. The Nolan Wells case may well benefit from Nancy Grace's spotlight, but the thousands of other cases that will never get a Nancy Grace, that will never get a Ben Crump or a Colin Kaepernick, or an hour of national cable coverage, deserve justice every bit as much. And the fact that their outcomes might genuinely depend on whether or not they happen to catch a celebrity's eye should trouble every single one of us. Even in the exact moment we feel grateful that the eye has landed somewhere it seemed to actually belong. Think through what that belief implies, if you follow it all the way to its logical end. It means two families suffering identical tragedies under nearly identical circumstances can receive wildly different levels of official urgency based on nothing more meaningful than which story happened to go viral, which family a famous person happened to notice, which case happened to arrive at exactly the right moment in an unpredictable national attention economy. That is not justice in any principled sense of the word. It is closer to a lottery, and the only ticket that matters is visibility. The genuinely heartbreaking part of all this is that given the system we actually have in front of us right now, playing that lottery is a completely rational thing for any desperate grieving family to do. If attention really does move outcomes, then of course a family seeks attention. Of course they welcome Ben Crump. Of course they welcome Al Sharpton. Of course when Nancy Grace finally turns her show toward their son, they feel something close to relief. The problem here is never the family's choice, which is an entirely wise and understandable one under the circumstances. The problem is a system in which that choice becomes necessary at all. A system in which the volume of your advocates can end up mattering nearly as much as the actual strength of your evidence. Celebrating Nancy Grace's arrival in this case and grieving the underlying system that makes her arrival feel absolutely essential to getting basic answers are two things that genuinely belong together. You do not have to choose between them. Before we go deeper into the evidence Nancy Grace actually presented, we want to say something directly to the people who have been with Mr. Story's Crime Vault since our very first video on this case. You have made this one of our fastest growing series, and we can see the numbers behind the scenes. Far more of you are watching than are actually subscribed. If you want to keep getting the version of the story that slows down, checks the facts, and does not chase the loudest headline just because it is loud, now is the moment to hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, and it tells this channel exactly what kind of coverage you want more of. Now let us actually walk through what Nancy Grace put on air piece by piece, because there is a lot more substance buried inside that broadcast than a single viral soundbite can capture, and some of it deserves genuine scrutiny in both directions. The centerpiece of her coverage was a piece of distress call audio obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, capturing what appears to be one of Nolan's friends radioing for help as their boat took on water near the western tip of Horn Island. In the raw recording, you can hear a voice telling the operator, "We are at the west tip of Horn and our bilge pump stopped working. We are sinking. Can you all please come?" The operator asks how far the water has risen. A voice responds, "Ankles." The call continues, halting, tense. The kind of audio that on its own simply documents a mechanical emergency on the water. The sort of thing that happens to boats every single season along the Gulf Coast. Grace's team brought in digital forensics experts to examine that same audio more closely, isolating background voices, adjusting gain levels, filtering out the foreground conversation between the caller and the dispatcher, in an attempt to make out what else was happening around the boat in that moment. According to her guest that night, once the background noise was isolated and enhanced, certain phrases became audible that had not been part of the original public reporting around this call. Phrases that appear to reference Nolan by name, and voices asking whether someone was all right. It is critical to be precise here about what that actually represents and what it does not. An enhanced, isolated audio track produced by a private forensic analyst working for a television program is not the same thing as an official finding entered into evidence by law enforcement. It is a claim made by specific named experts about what they believe they can hear once certain audio processing techniques have been applied. That claim may turn out to be accurate. It may turn out to be an artifact of enhancement, the kind of thing where noise reduction software can sometimes create phantom patterns that sound like words but are not actually there. Both possibilities remain open until an official verified forensic analysis is entered into the public record, which as of this recording has not happened. What we can say with confidence is this. The audio itself in its original unenhanced form has been independently confirmed as authentic, obtained through a records request to a real state agency, not fabricated, not doctored in the sense of being invented from nothing. What remains genuinely uncertain is exactly what can and cannot be reliably discerned from it, once you start pushing enhancement further than the original recording was ever designed to support. Grace also spent considerable time on the boat's full GPS timeline, obtained separately by other outlets through public records requests to the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. According to that data, the vessel left its original dock at approximately 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island by 11:14. It left the island again around 4:31 that afternoon, matching the time frame of the distress call, was towed, reportedly 3 miles, before continuing under its own power, returned to its original dock, then traveled into a nearby waterway called Fort Bayou, returned to the dock again, and later that evening was moved to a boat launch before apparently being towed overland by trailer back to the owner's residence. Grace's question, echoed by more than one legal analyst covering this case, was straightforward. If the boat was genuinely taking on water and sinking at 4:30 that afternoon, why does the same vessel appear to be moving between multiple locations for hours afterward, rather than being pulled from the water immediately for repair? That is a fair evidence-based question rooted directly in a public records document, not in speculation. It does not on its own prove anything sinister happened. Boats get partially repaired on the water all the time. A failing bilge pump does not necessarily mean a vessel is in danger of fully sinking within minutes. It can simply mean a slow, manageable leak that a crew decides to monitor rather than immediately abandon. But it is a real documented gap in the timeline that a thorough investigation would need to explain. And as of tonight, no official explanation for that specific gap has been made public. Grace brought in a digital forensics and cybercrime expert, a former detective sergeant with decades of law enforcement experience. specifically to walk through what it would actually take to verify or debunk the enhanced audio being discussed on her program. His answer was measured in a way that a lot of online commentary on the same audio has not been. He explained that verifying a recording like this involves isolating individual voice signals, adjusting gain levels to separate foreground speech from background conversation, and cross-referencing ambient noise to confirm the recording actually matches the location and circumstances it claims to represent. That is not a process that happens in an afternoon, and it is not a process a television panel can complete on air in real time, no matter how many times a clip gets replayed. What he offered was a roadmap for how a real forensic analysis would need to proceed, not a finished conclusion. That distinction between describing a method and delivering a verdict is exactly the kind of nuance that tends to get lost the moment a clip like this one gets clipped again for a 15-second repost. Grace devoted a significant portion of her broadcast to the still-pending autopsy, and this is an area where her prosecutorial background genuinely adds something useful to the public conversation, precisely because so much of the online commentary on this case has gotten the basic medicine wrong. According to reports the family's team has confirmed, when Nolan's body was transported for the independent family-commissioned autopsy in Washington, D.C., the examining physician there did not have access to the lungs or the throat tissue that had apparently been retained by the original medical examiner in Mississippi. Online, this detail spread almost instantly as proof of a cover-up. Grace, drawing on a forensic pathologist she brought onto her program, walked through a far more measured, technically grounded explanation for why a medical examiner might retain those specific structures during an active investigation into a possible drowning. In cases where drowning is suspected, tissue from the neck, specifically the hyoid bone and surrounding cartilage, is sometimes preserved separately so that decomposition artifacts can be distinguished from actual trauma. When a body has spent time in warm coastal water for several days, blood can diffuse through tissue after death in ways that mimic bruising to the untrained eye, and a careful examiner needs uninterrupted time with that specific tissue, sometimes involving further microscopic sectioning, to tell the difference between genuine antemortem injury and simple postmortem decomposition. That is a legitimate medically grounded reason an examiner might hold on to those particular structures rather than releasing the full body immediately. It is not on its own proof of concealment. It is standard forensic caution applied to an ambiguous case. At the same time, Grace pushed back reasonably on a separate detail that is also circulated. Photographs reportedly showing deep reddish discoloration beneath the skin at the back of Nolan's head near the occipital bone. One explanation offered was that this discoloration represented simple postmortem lividity, blood settling naturally due to gravity after death. Grace's objection to that explanation was a fair one to raise publicly. If it were ordinary lividity, why would that discoloration appear concentrated specifically at the back of the head, rather than distributed more broadly across the back of the body, where gravity would ordinarily pull blood in a person who died lying in that position? The forensic pathologist she consulted offered a plausible middle answer, that decomposition and the specific mechanics of the autopsy process itself, including how the scalp is reflected during examination, can concentrate discoloration in that particular area without necessarily indicating a blow to the head. Neither of them, to their credit, claimed certainty. Both stated clearly that determining the true cause of that discoloration requires direct microscopic examination of the actual tissue, examination that is either still underway or has not yet been made public. This is precisely the kind of detail where sourcing discipline matters enormously, and where a lot of other coverage of this case has failed. It would be irresponsible to tell you that discoloration proves Nolan was struck before he entered the water. It would be equally irresponsible to tell you it definitely proves nothing at all. The honest answer, the only answer supported by what has actually been made public so far, is that this is an open forensic question. One more piece of evidence sitting inside a case file that has not yet been fully released, and one that both the state's medical examiner and the family's independent examiner will need to resolve before anyone, including Nancy Grace, including us, including you, can responsibly draw a conclusion from it. Grace did not build that segment alone, and it is worth understanding the other voices she surrounded herself with, because they represent two very different lenses this case keeps getting pulled through. On one side sat a veteran criminal defense attorney with a background in domestic violence advocacy who argued that standard investigative procedure in a case like this one is not complicated at all. Separate every witness. Question them individually on video, with their rights read aloud before a single question is asked. Ask whether each one would voluntarily sit for a polygraph, understanding fully that polygraph results are not admissible in a criminal trial unless both sides agreed to it beforehand, the way they were famously excluded from the criminal trial of O.J. Simpson, but later admitted and failed in the civil case that followed. Bring trained cadaver dogs and scent dogs onto the vessel itself, understanding that a scent dog would likely register a hit simply because Nolan is known to have been aboard that boat at some point that day, while a cadaver dog's response would carry a very different and far more serious meaning entirely. That attorney was careful to draw a hard line between describing what proper procedure looks like and declaring that any specific person had done anything wrong. Proper procedure, she argued, is simply what protects everyone involved. The family searching for truth and the friends who may have nothing to hide at all. On the other side of that same panel sat a psychotherapist and author who focused less on procedure and more on the emotional terrain surrounding the case. The online hostility being directed at anyone who dared ask a question, and the strange dynamic in which people who have lost absolutely nothing personally in this story have nonetheless appointed themselves the loudest voices defending one version of events over another. He made a point worth repeating here because it cuts against the mob dynamic we spent so much time on earlier. Wanting answers is not the same thing as wanting a specific group of people to be guilty. Pursuing the truth, he argued, should never require anyone to already know what that truth is going to be before the evidence has actually arrived to tell them. Both of those framings, the procedural one and the psychological one, matter to how you should be thinking about this case tonight. Proper investigative procedure protects the innocent every bit as much as it exposes the guilty, and a genuine pursuit of truth requires exactly the kind of patience that a nationally televised, emotionally charged hour of programming makes almost impossible to sustain. Now we have to talk carefully and responsibly about the contradiction at the center of the public argument over Nolan's final hours, because it is the single detail Grace leaned on most heavily, and it is also the detail most likely to be misused if we are not precise about exactly what is and is not established. According to the account given by Nolan's friends, he chose to remain on Horn Island because he wanted to keep talking with a young woman he had met that day, someone referred to publicly as Katie. According to a separate account relayed publicly not by Katie herself, but through a Facebook post written by her sister Gracie McCormack, Katie's understanding of that final conversation was different. Per that post, Nolan's friends had been pressuring him to wrap up the conversation so he could leave with them, and based on what he told her, Katie believed he intended to get on the boat and leave with the group, the same boat she assumed he was heading toward when she made it home safely that day on a separate vessel with other family members. It is essential to be exact about the nature of this account. It is secondhand. It comes filtered through a sibling's public social media post, not a sworn statement, not a direct on-camera interview from Katie herself. As of this recording, Katie has not given a personal on-air interview to any major outlet. That does not mean the account is false. Family members relaying a loved one's story publicly is a completely normal thing to do, especially when that loved one has been thrust into a national news story she never asked to be part of, and has reportedly received threats simply for being mentioned by name. But it does mean the account exists at one remove from Katie's own voice, and it should be weighed accordingly, neither dismissed nor treated as an ironclad courtroom-ready fact. What strengthens the credibility of the contradiction, independent of that second-hand account, is a separate on-the-record statement given by Javon Williams, described by Nolan's own family and friends as his best friend, who was also present on Horn Island that day. Williams told the Biloxi Sun-Herald directly under his own name that he last saw Nolan after 4 o'clock that afternoon spending time with a young woman and other friends, and separately told CNN something that stands in direct tension with the story the wider friend group has presented publicly. "I have never known Nolan to stay back while his friends leave," Williams said. "He has always been a guy where if he rode with you, he is going to come back with you. That is always how he has been every single time." A best friend describing a lifelong consistent pattern of behavior, on the record, under his own name, to 2 separate news organizations, is a meaningfully different category of evidence than a second-hand family social media post. Even when both point in roughly the same direction, it is a kind of statement that can be followed up on, checked against other witnesses, and weighed by investigators in a way that a Facebook post cannot be weighed in quite the same manner. Put those 2 things side by side honestly, and here is what you actually have. A best friend speaking under his own name saying this simply is not who Nolan was, and a young woman's family speaking on her behalf saying he told her he was heading back to the boat. Neither one of those accounts on its own tells you conclusively what happened to Nolan Wells that afternoon. But together they raise the exact same question his own father raised publicly in the earliest days of this case. Why was this the one single day out of every day these friends had spent together that nobody followed the only rule his parents had ever asked of him? If you go with a group, you stay with a group. That question does not disappear just because more names have entered the story since it was first asked. If anything, hearing it echoed independently now by a best friend speaking on the record, rather than only by a grieving parent, makes it considerably harder to write off as simple parental grief talking. None of this, to be absolutely clear, constitutes an accusation against Katie, against Javon Williams, against any of the friends who were on that boat, or against anyone else who has not been charged with any crime. It is and remains an unresolved factual contradiction that investigators need to sort out using tools none of us watching from home actually have access to. Full witness interviews conducted separately, phone forensics, and physical evidence. There is also the matter of misinformation, and here is where we need to give real credit to the correction process that unfolded, even as it exposed exactly how fragile the truth can become once a case reaches this scale of public attention. Early in this case, a photo began circulating online, apparently showing Nolan at a pool party, alongside a claim that he had actually made it back to the mainland alive, attended a gathering, been involved in an altercation, and was later returned to the water. Ben Crump himself reposted that image with a caption explicitly stating he did not know whether the underlying claims were fact or rumor, and that his team was following every lead until the truth was found. For a large portion of the internet, that repost was treated as effective confirmation, and the theory spread far beyond anything the caption actually claimed. Rolling Stone subsequently investigated the photo's actual origin and published its findings using photo metadata obtained from an independent source. The outlet determined the image had been taken on June 27th, a full 8 days before the 4th of July, not after Horn Island, as the viral rumor claimed. Traken Shepard, a close friend of Nolan's who is black and part of the same friend group, independently confirmed the same date and identified the people in the photograph, including Nolan, stating clearly that the gathering took place in Pass Christian, Mississippi, more than a week before Nolan ever stepped onto a boat bound for Horn Island. The image had simply been uploaded as part of an unrelated batch of older photos on July 5th, and the difference between the date something is taken and the date it happens to be posted online turned out to be the entire foundation of a rumor that reached hundreds of thousands of views before anyone bothered to check it. The second major piece of viral evidence involved a video shot from a boat near Horn Island capturing what sounded like a heated exchange, with a voice heard demanding, "Give me my freaking phone, what are you freaking doing?" Ben Crump referenced that video publicly on Good Morning America, stating he believed the voice belonged to Nolan. Traken Shepard came forward again, this time to clarify directly to ABC News that the voice in that specific clip was his own, recorded during a separate altercation he had with someone else entirely, an altercation that had nothing to do with Nolan and that two friends had actually been physically restraining him during. "That is the video I am referring to," Shepard said, "and that is me yelling." Crump, to his credit, acknowledged this contradiction directly and publicly, rather than quietly letting the earlier claim keep circulating unchallenged. At a press conference, when asked directly whether his team had confirmed the identity of the voice, he stated plainly that one witness had originally told his team it was Nolan, that his team reported that account at the time, and that since then another witness had come forward disputing it. He committed on the record to being more careful going forward about clearly labeling what a single witness told his team versus what has actually been independently confirmed. Both of these corrections matter enormously to how you should weigh everything else in this case, including everything Nancy Grace said on her broadcast. It tells you that this particular investigation has already generated real provable misinformation that spread at massive scale before anyone caught it. It tells you that even the family's own legal team has in good faith repeated claims that later needed to be walked back. And it tells you that Traken Shepard specifically has now stepped forward twice, under his own name, at real personal risk given that he and his friends have reportedly received death threats over this case, to correct the public record, even when doing so did not necessarily serve the narrative that was already spreading in his friend group's favor. That is worth remembering the next time a clip shows up in your feed, claiming to be definitive proof of something in this case. Ask where it actually came from before you believe it. Ask again before you share it. So where does that leave us with Nancy Grace specifically, and what she has actually added to this case beyond volume? The honest answer is that she has amplified questions that were already sitting in the public record, applied a genuinely useful prosecutorial lens to some of them, particularly around the autopsy and the boat's timeline, gotten a few details right that deserve real scrutiny, and in the process also fed directly into the exact mob dynamic that has already caused real harm to real uncharged people connected to this case. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and refusing to hold them together is how a genuine search for the truth quietly curdles into something else entirely. What Nancy Grace's involvement cannot do, no matter how large her platform is, no matter how many decades of prosecutorial instinct she brings to a broadcast, is actually resolve this case. She has no legal authority here. She cannot indict anyone. She cannot arrest anyone. She cannot convict anyone. What she has is influence, and influence is a tool, one that can be aimed carefully or aimed recklessly, sometimes by the very same person within the very same hour of television. Aimed carefully, that influence means demanding real transparency from Jackson County officials. It means keeping a legitimate, still unresolved case visible to a national audience long after most cable news cycles would have already moved on. It means insisting that officials show their work, rather than simply asking the public to trust that the work is being done correctly behind closed doors. Aimed recklessly, that same influence means feeding public certainty well ahead of the actual facts and pointing an enormous emotionally invested audience towards specific named private individuals who have been accused of absolutely nothing in any formal sense. The questions Grace raised about the phone data, about the boat's inexplicable movements after the supposed sinking, about the retained autopsy tissue, those are genuinely the right questions for anyone following this case to be asking. Whether the enormous wave of attention she brings with her ultimately serves the truth or ends up stampeding straight past it depends entirely on whether everyone downstream of her broadcast, every viewer, every commenter, every other channel covering this story, including this one, treats her questions as questions rather than as verdicts already handed down. That is really the heart of everything we have walked through tonight. A big enough platform can force an institution to take a case seriously. It cannot by itself make that case's eventual resolution just. Only the actual evidence can do that. And evidence does not care how many people are watching or how confident and famous the person demanding answers happens to be. Here is where this case actually stands as of right now, stripped of speculation and stripped of viral certainty, based only on what has been publicly and officially confirmed. Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, along with Ben Crump and their legal team, met directly with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McGrath. Out of that meeting came two confirmed developments. First, once the Sheriff's Department completes its investigation, the case will be turned over to a grand jury. It is worth being precise about what that actually means and does not mean. A grand jury referral for an unnatural or suspicious death is described by the District Attorney's own office as standard procedure in Jackson County, not on its own an indication that criminal charges are imminent or even likely. It means a panel of citizens will eventually review whatever evidence prosecutors choose to present and decide whether an indictment is warranted. That is a meaningfully more serious step than an investigation simply continuing indefinitely in the background, but it is not the same thing as an arrest, and it is not the same thing as a guaranteed criminal case. Second, both sides have agreed to a mutual simultaneous inspection of Nolan's phone, meaning the family's own forensic experts and official law enforcement investigators will examine the device's data together in the same room at the same time, seeing exactly the same information pulled in exactly the same way. Legal analysts covering this case have described that arrangement as highly unusual, a direct response to distrust that built up after the family reported finding two Snapchat accounts apparently wiped clean, with no saved photos or videos from July 4th, despite Nolan being by every account an avid and constant user of the app. The state's official autopsy remains pending, with officials citing an ongoing wait for toxicology results, a process that can reasonably take weeks regardless of how much national attention a given case receives. The family's independent autopsy, conducted separately in Washington, D.C., has also not yet produced publicly released findings, delayed in part, according to Crump, by logistical complications transporting Nolan's body. Sheriff Ledbetter has confirmed his department has been in contact with the FBI. Though it is worth being precise here too, federal involvement in this case stems from the fact that Horn Island sits on federal land within the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which is a jurisdictional reality, not on its own evidence that federal agents have uncovered something dramatic behind the scenes. Under Mississippi law, a victim's family is entitled to receive an incident report within 72 hours. That window passed without the family receiving one, and Christine Wansley has said publicly that for a period of more than a week, the only contact she had from the Sheriff's Department was a single text message she sent herself asking for any kind of update. The District Attorney's Office has since taken over as the primary point of communication with the family going forward, with a dedicated victim advocate assigned to the case, an arrangement Crump described as an improvement, even as he was careful to note that the earlier gap in communication had genuinely happened and had genuinely hurt. On July 20th, Nolan was laid to rest at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with Reverend Al Sharpton officiating at the family's request and Tyler Perry covering the costs. The visitation ran from 9 to 11 that morning, with the service beginning immediately after. Afterward, the family held what Christine Wansley specifically asked people to think of, not as a repast, but as a celebration of life, held at the Jackson County Fairgrounds. His mother described wanting the service to feel less like a funeral and more like a party, because in her words, Nolan would never want a room full of people simply sitting and crying. He would want a party. She invited former coaches, teammates from every level he had ever played at, classmates going back to middle school, and notably, she chose to let media into that celebration as well, rather than keeping it strictly private. That choice deserves to be named for what it actually represents. A mother who does not yet have her son's official cause of death chose deliberately to let cameras into the most painful day of her life, because she has said clearly that the danger she fears most is not scrutiny. It is silence. It is the world quietly losing interest before her son gets the answers he deserves. Separately, attorney Eric Hertz, who is helping lead the family's independent investigative team alongside former law enforcement officials and former federal agents, has confirmed that his office alone is fielding somewhere between 50 and 100 calls a day from people who were on Horn Island that day, or who know someone who was. Some of those callers, according to Hertz, are choosing to speak only to the family's independent team, not to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office directly, a detail that says something uncomfortable about how much trust remains between the community and local law enforcement at this stage of the investigation. Hertz has stated the goal is not to build a separate competing case file, but to get those witnesses connected with official investigators so their accounts become part of the actual record, rather than disappearing into private phone calls that never reach anyone with the authority to act on them. Every one of these facts is confirmed, sourced, and on the public record. Everything beyond this, the exact cause of death, whose voice belongs in which recording, what precisely happened in the window between 3 and 4:30 that afternoon on Horn Island, remains genuinely, honestly, unresolved. Not because nobody is looking, but because the actual answers have not yet been made public by the people with the legal authority and the forensic tools to determine them. So here is what we are actually asking you to sit with tonight. And it is less a question about Nolan Wells specifically than it is a question about all of us, and about the world we have collectively built around cases exactly like his. We have constructed a system in which a grieving family's odds of getting real answers can genuinely improve the moment a television host with millions of viewers decides their story is worth an hour of national airtime. Be honest with yourself about how that actually makes you feel, because it is more complicated than a single emotion. Part of you, the part that simply wants justice for an 18-year-old kid who never made it home, is glad the spotlight found him. That gladness is completely valid, and you should not talk yourself out of it. But another part of you should feel genuinely uneasy, because that exact same system means justice ends up being rationed out according to fame. And because the very same spotlight that helps pressure officials in this case has already provably burned real innocent, uncharged people standing inside this exact story. Hold both of those feelings at the same time. Do not rush to resolve them into something simpler than they actually are. The arrival of Nancy Grace in the Nolan Wells case matters precisely because it forces that uncomfortable question directly into the open in a way that is impossible to look away from. And the honest answer to it is not a cheer, and it is not a dismissal either. It is something harder than either of those. A careful, watchful insistence on the actual evidence, paired with a genuine determination to protect the people caught in the blast radius of a story this large. It asks you to want the spotlight to force the truth out into the open, while refusing to let that same spotlight decide what the truth is in advance. It asks you to be grateful for the pressure landing on officials, while staying genuinely vigilant about the pressure landing on private individuals who have never been charged with anything. It asks you to hold a confident broadcaster's questions as questions, and keep your own certainty firmly in check, even when a compelling trusted voice is inviting you to abandon it entirely. None of that fits neatly on a protest sign. None of it is nearly as satisfying as simply declaring that the cavalry has arrived and justice is now inevitable. But it is the only posture that actually serves a young man who is no longer here to speak for himself, rather than serving the appetite of an audience that has quietly confused a cable news segment with an actual verdict. Nancy Grace can help keep this door open. Only the evidence, whenever it finally comes, can tell us what is actually behind it. And confusing those two things is exactly how a genuine good faith search for justice curdles into something far less honest and far less useful to the one family that actually needs the truth more than anyone watching at home ever will. We are going to keep following this case exactly the way we have from the very beginning. No speculation dressed up as confirmed fact. No named private citizen treated as a suspect just because a comment section has already decided they are guilty. Every claim clearly labeled as either confirmed, alleged, or simply unresolved. That is the only kind of coverage a story like this one deserves, and it is the only kind we are interested in putting our name on. If tonight's breakdown gave you something the louder, faster versions of the story did not, that is exactly the gap Mr. Story's Crime Vault exists to fill. We know the numbers behind the scenes, and right now far more of you are watching these videos than are actually subscribed to get them delivered the moment they go live. If you want to be here for the grand jury update, for whichever autopsy result lands first, for the next piece of misinformation we have to slow down and correct before it spreads any further, take a moment right now and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it tells us exactly what kind of coverage this community actually wants more of. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, an honor student, a wide receiver with his whole future in front of him, a young man who cooked dinner and had conversation with his mother the night before he left, who told her he loved her, and who never got the chance to come home and tell her again. Whatever this investigation eventually reveals, whatever a grand jury eventually decides, whatever answer the toxicology reports finally give his family, that is the person this entire story is actually about. Not a hashtag, not a cable segment, not a comment section argument. A son, a friend, a young man who deserved to come home on the 4th of July and did not. Somewhere in Ocean Springs tonight, Christine Wansley is still waking up every morning to a house that carries her son's absence in every room of it. She is still fielding calls from investigators, from attorneys, from strangers claiming to have seen something on Horn Island that day. She is still, by her own account, leaning as hard as she can on her faith to get through days that most parents never have to imagine surviving. Nancy Grace's cameras will eventually move on to the next case, the way cable news cameras always eventually move on. Ben Crump's team will eventually close this file, whether with an indictment or without one. The internet will eventually find a new story to argue about, a new villain to appoint, a new mystery to solve from the safety of a comment section. Christine Wansley will not get that luxury. She will still be a mother without her son, long after every camera covering this story has packed up and gone home. That is the thing worth carrying with you out of this video. More than any single detail about a distress call, a phone's location data, or the color of tissue beneath a young man's skull. Whatever role Nancy Grace ends up playing in whether this case finally gets resolved, the actual weight of this story belongs and will always belong to a family that would trade every headline, every hashtag, every hour of national television coverage for one more ordinary dinner with their son at their table. We will be back with the next verified update the moment there is one. Whether that is the grand jury's next move, the results of either autopsy, or the next piece of misinformation we need to slow down and correct before it spreads any further than it already has. Until then, this has been Mr. Story's Crime Vault.